Commissioner Albert, since 2018, both OMB and GSA have pushed for the establishment of a federal capital revolving fund, as you know, for large capital projects to encourage the purchase of real property instead of entering into expensive leases. So my question for you is how would the establishment of this fund reduce federal real property costs in your estimation?
So I'll analogize this to a private sector portfolio. Rent that the private sector collects typically goes into paying the maintenance costs of a building, and then perhaps there's a reserve that's created in order to deal with unexpected or emergency issues. However, when there's a major capital project or a new project that a developer or that an owner wants to take on, they typically do raise equity and take on debt. And that's how a new facility gets built. So right now, the Federal Buildings Fund is that first bucket of responsibilities. Take in rent, pay for maintenance and repairs, create a reserve of some sort so that you can deal with the existing asset base that you have. The Capital Revolving Fund, I think, is proposed to be that second piece, a pool or a source of funds in order to execute on large capital projects, rather than having large capital projects and new construction compete with the maintenance of assets. And so that is the concept. I think that if we could establish a dedicated fund source for major capital projects, there would be significant benefit because we wouldn't be competing with the FBF. I think that there are a number of things that we should and would like to discuss with you about how to make the Capital Revolving Fund function so that it in fact achieves the goals that I just stated, because there are complexities to it, but it is a concept that we would be interested in exploring with you.
Very good. The federal real property disposal process is basically meant to prevent the government from wasting tax dollars. But as I mentioned in my opening comments, the federal government continues to maintain unneeded facilities. In fact, in fiscal year 21, federal agencies reported over 7% of the buildings owned by the federal agencies were either underutilized or unutilized. So, Commissioner Albert, what additional authorities or tools would allow the GSA to dispose of property more quickly? Are there some recommendations you'd have for us?
There are a couple recommendations in particular that are focused specifically on being able to dispose faster. I mentioned, of course, getting access to the Federal Buildings Fund because the sale proceeds go into that fund, and so we would want to be able to revolve or utilize those funds in future disposition activity. It's the same concept that Representative Rahal and Mr. Maroney have mentioned as well, that retention of net proceeds and the authority to spend it. So that's number one. The second, which is a legislative proposal that we've put into our 24 budget request for the 5th year in a row, is to expand our disposal authority or expand the permitted uses for a 190A account. That account is approximately $80 million. We are only allowed to use that money for disposal activities once a report of excess has been created. We believe that getting access to those funds prior to an official report of excess by the agency will help incentivize agencies to consider disposing of properties. So I believe there's a fund that's already there, it's already appropriated, and what we need to do is expand when we get access to it. And then lastly, this is a tool that FASTA has really brought to light as to how effective it can be, which is, again, I mentioned that sale leaseback authority under a defined term. Within FASTA, they've secured sale leaseback authority for 3 years. Again, that allows us to dispose of property, put it into the private sector hands. With the private sector having a guaranteed form of income for the next 2 or 3 years, it actually enhances the value of the property. So you do it for a limited period of time, which buys us time to move that agency out. I think that 3 years is pretty tight in many cases, and I would seek to expand that sale-leaseback authority 5 years, 7 years. So I think those three things right now would really be an opportunity to accelerate. And then Senator Langford mentioned talking about how could we, convey some of the risk and the cost of remediation to the private sector. That's a very typical transactional negotiation that the private sector is used to. I'd like to explore around the margins how we could maybe convey or that risk to the private sector in the cases where they're available and ready to absorb it.
Very good. Another question for you, Commissioner Albert, is could you update the committee on the Department of Homeland Security property consolidation efforts that are underway at St. Elizabeth? Where are we right now on that?
Absolutely. I am glad to announce that with the approval of our FY23 budget, we are advancing on Phase 3 of the consolidation. This is a consolidation of 12 million square feet of property occupied by DHS. We have already completed Phases 1 and 2. And now with Phase 3, we have begun and actually put out the RFPs for program management services, construction management services, to build CIS's headquarters, INA's headquarters, and ICE's headquarters at St. Elizabeth's. In '24, we are seeking appropriation for the last component of the consolidation, which are those facilities located at the Nebraska Avenue complex in Washington, D.C. So we are on the cusp of completing the build-out of the consolidation of DHS at St. Elizabeth's, and very excited that we're able to deliver on those projects that have been long promised.
Right. Well, that's good. Good news. Good news. FASTA requires GSA to maintain a public database of all federal real property. However, the Congressional Research Service has found that the value of the federal real property profile management system as an oversight and policy tool has been limited by inaccurate and incomplete information. As of 2020, only 23% of the properties listed in the federal real property profile management system has a complete address. Mr. Maroney, GO has noted that reliability of federal real property data is the main reason that real property management remains on the high-risk list. So my question for you is why is this data so important, and what can Congress do to improve the federal real property profile management system so we have the data we need?
So the data is important because it's hard to manage federal real property if you don't know the condition of the properties, if you don't have good data on what properties are actually in excess, their utilization. You need that information to identify prime candidates for disposal. I think we have talked about some of the issues with data already during the FASTA process. This has been a longstanding issue on our high-risk list. We have made recommendations in this space that remain open. To GSA's credit, they have taken actions to improve the data over time, but there still needs to be improved validation and verification. It's also a complex challenge because the agencies self-report the data into FRPP, so each agency needs to provide accurate data and up-to-date data. And I would say the third thing you asked about, what can Congress do? I would say continued oversight and pushing on the agencies to report data that is accurate and complete. Again, particularly on variables that change, like utilization. Right now, as we exit the pandemic, it's important to know how well these buildings are being utilized, what space may be unneeded. There's not good data right now on that for many buildings in the federal portfolio. It's important for Congress to push agencies to move towards better data on that front.
All right. And Representative Rahal, perhaps you give us a little more detail as to how that's impacted the board's ability to make recommendations.
Well, one thing I would say, Mr. Chairman, is that the OMB has denied the executive director of the PBRB a seat on the Federal Real Property Council. This would be an important improvement if we could have our executive director a seat on that senior federal property executive board. It further stifles, without that seat on the board, the PBRB's access to the information it needs about the shifting federal workforce. And we know in post-COVID era that it is shifting rather dramatically. So we need a partnership, a co-partnership here, if you will, with GSA and OMB to work through this issue and at least allow our executive director a seat on that council. This would be a big step forward in allowing us to have access to the information we need. So I think, again, if we could have better coordination, and I believe David's report touches on this issue rather accurately about our lack of data and access to that data.
Commissioner Albert, do you still intend to make the federal real property database publicly available if FASTA expires without reauthorization?
Yeah, I want to clarify, the FRPP, the Federal Real Property Profile Database, actually has been available publicly on a website since 2016. I want to underscore the comment that Mr. Maroney made, which is that GSA functions in two capacities in terms of managing and inputting into the FRPP. First is there's a component of GSA that does government-wide support, and so is working, for example, with DOD as a major landholder and other major landholding agencies to take all of that information and manage the database. Then the Public Building Service, which is a component of GSA, which is the component I'm responsible for, as a major landholding company, inputs information about our portfolio into the database. So, I believe that the Public Building Service input into the database has been done regularly, as well as comprehensively as possible, and to the extent that there are data inconsistencies or incomplete data, it's because there's an underlying issue that we need to work through. And I would extend, as a landholding agency, that assumption and, frankly, knowledge that that is challenging for other landholding agencies as well. But we continue to work on the process, candidly, and I believe that the guidance and improvements that we've made both in the database itself over the past 2 years is going to continue to improve the quality of the database itself. I do want to make one point. The FRPP is an inventory of all of the federal portfolio. It is not an asset management tool. And those are two different functions and things. And so I think it is incredibly important to have an inventory and an accurate inventory of the property that the federal government owns, but that will not tell you everything that you need to know about how to manage that property. So I'm just making that distinction so that everyone understands what the purpose of the tool is. And many landholding agencies do have individual asset management tools.
Mr. Albert, it has taken 2 years to sell 10 of the 12 properties approved for disposal under FASTA, and the 2 properties that are expected to result in the highest return still have not been sold. So my question for you is, what's caused these delays, and when do you expect to sell the remaining properties, and do you anticipate similar delays in the final FASTA round?
Okay. As to the first 10 properties that were sold, taking 2 years, there was, again, I attribute this to kind of ramping up and starting a new agency and integrating that new agency's work with GSA's work. So about 1 year, I believe, of the 2 years was spent talking about and deciding on how to dispose of those properties. Again, I referenced the tactics or the strategies. But once it was determined how we were going to offer those properties, the sale all occurred within a year. So again, just working through some of the kinks of an upstart or of a new startup. As to the 2 remaining properties, which are, I believe, really great disposal candidates, I can speak specifically to them. The property that we own at Menlo Park has a remaining tenant in it. That tenant had plans to move out. They got delayed during COVID. They're back on track to move out in 2024, which means that we'll be able to offer that property, we believe, within the next year. As to Laguna Niguel, another major asset that we own, Unfortunately, we put it on the market, and we didn't get any bidders. We believe that the historic preservation covenants that were published deterred and chilled the market interest in that property. And so we are working right now with the local jurisdiction to figure out how we can soften, lift, or accommodate in some other way the historic covenants that are on sort of the main asset at Laguna Niguel. So these are the types of issues that need to be worked through, particularly when we're dealing with complicated real assets.
Right. Thank you. Representative Rahal.
In my prepared testimony, I addressed the Laguna Niguel issue and the three factors that we feel on the PBRB were the caused the result that there were no bids on this property. It's a highly valuable piece of property, and it is a shame that there were no bids received. But one of the primary factors was the lack of market interest. And that, of course, was due to some of the remediation issues that were involved and the GSA's decision to reject acceptable alternatives. Another factor was the lack of publicity. There were just no marketing like any business firm would market their product for sale, and therefore lack of awareness among the 22 surveyed local commercial developers. 16, for example, were not aware of the auction since no commercially standard process of marketing was used. A third factor was the uncertainty surrounding the zoning and the local community intent. So this asset remains unsold, as you have referenced, while negotiations continue with the historic preservation process. We have advised GSA that a consultant is needed to facilitate this sale, given the complexities with the historic preservation and the potential rezoning once the property leaves the federal ownership. So the government needs to demonstrate innovation and in how these excess properties are managed, and the board needs more authority in determining the disposal strategy, and I've referenced that earlier in my comments.
Right.